I'm Tanya Farouk, and I will be talking about evaluating disability representation in young adult and children's literature. As Joan Blasko writes, children with disabilities or illnesses need to see people similar to them. Perhaps no group has been as overlooked and inaccurately presented in children's books as individuals with disabilities. Most often they were not included in stories, and when they were, many negative stereotypes prevailed. It is important for librarians and educators to learn how to evaluate fictional depictions of characters with disabilities. As Karen Gavigan explains, disability representation should help readers gain an accurate understanding of disabilities and ensure that readers with disabilities see their experiences represented realistically and sensitively. There are several lists of guidelines for evaluating the representation of disability in young adult and children's literature. This presentation will summarize the common themes of these assessment methods and suggest some general guidelines, such as avoiding stereotypes and selecting books that feature complex characterization, sensitive language, literary quality, realism, and accuracy. Beeklin and Bogdan helped start the discussion of disability representation in fiction in a 1977 article in which they list 10 negative and inaccurate stereotypes about people with disabilities that were present in the literature at that time. These stereotypes portray people with disabilities as pitiable and pathetic, objects of violence, sinister or evil, in the background to provide atmosphere, superhumans whose powers negate their disabilities, objects of ridicule or insensitive comedy, hypochondriacs who are their own worst and only enemies, a burden on the other characters, non-sexual, or incapable of fully participating in everyday life. As an example of these stereotypes, Beeklin and Bogdan included an illustration of a scene from the classic children's book Heidi, which was written by Joanna Spyri in 1881. The character Clara uses a wheelchair, but after her wheelchair is destroyed, she gains the motivation to learn to walk. Stories like these can promote the inaccurate stereotype that people with disabilities would be cured if they only had enough determination and willpower. While it is interesting to examine specific examples of outdated or stereotypical representation, it is also important to consider the underlying assumptions and misconceptions behind these stereotypes. I think that many stereotypes fall into one of three general categories or themes. One common theme is the portrayal of people with disabilities as one-dimensional supporting characters, whose entire purpose is to encourage growth in the other characters or teach a moral lesson. The next group of stereotypes involves characters with disabilities being eliminated from the story, for example by dying or being cured. While these seem like very different outcomes, as Isabel Britton notes, the implication is that the author fails to see a happy and fulfilled life being a possibility for a character with a disability. Finally, a theme discussed by many educators is the dehumanization of characters with disabilities. According to Britton, this dehumanization can occur through negative representation, such as portraying people with disabilities as inherently evil or comparing them to animals or objects. But it can also be through unrealistically positive representation, such as portraying people with disabilities as completely good or giving them superpowers that negate their disabilities. While Beeklin and Bogdan helped start a conversation about negative stereotypes, educators since then have focused on positive recommendations, emphasizing the need for complex and realistic characters with disabilities. Several educators have created lists of guidelines for positive representation. For example, Blaska and Lynch's Images and Encounters profile promotes acceptance, empathy, respect, and understanding of people with disabilities. Prater and Deitch's Exemplary Practices portray characters with disabilities as contributors in inclusive settings with an emphasis on acceptance rather than on rejection and on similarities rather than on differences. Many discussions of complex characterization mention the need for realism. Similarly, another important guideline for evaluating disability representation is accuracy. This is important because disability fiction can help readers gain an accurate understanding of a disability, as Blasko writes. Emily Whopper also discusses the need for accurate representation and provides some suggestions for how authors can create accurate representations and how librarians can assess these representations. Whopper suggests that if, as a school librarian, you are unsure or feel you are not qualified to judge the accuracy, seek out a professional who is or do some research on the subject yourself. Likewise, Whopper mentions that to create an accurate and believable character, authors must be committed to extensive research. She provides an example of an author who interviewed burn specialists, social workers, nurses, physiotherapists, and even interviewed children and their families living with severe burns. The use of the word even seems to imply that at the time, an author interviewing a person with a disability was considered to be somewhat exceptional rather than an important step in research. Likewise, Nassatir and Horn list some criteria for evaluating the accuracy of disability representation, including the author or illustrator's background and perspective. Interestingly, they suggest that authors or illustrators may know people with disabilities, but do not mention the possibility that people with disabilities might write or illustrate books. Another guideline mentioned by several educators, such as Prater and Deitches, is the need for literary and illustrative quality. As Heim writes, being about something cannot excuse a poorly written book. The need for quality literature may appear obvious now, but Heim implies that at the time, many children's books about characters with disabilities were more didactic than compelling. Similarly, several lists also mention the need for sensitive language. Beeklin and Bogdan discuss the importance of avoiding terms that dehumanize or objectify people with disabilities. While some of the terms they recommend are now considered outdated, the general principles are true. Since then, other educators have emphasized the need for sensitive language. Nassatir and Horn recommend avoiding loaded words that could be considered harmful or offensive to people with disabilities, and Wafferer mentions that older books may contain outdated language. Many of these lists of guidelines have elaborated on existing recommendations. The discussion of disability representation has progressed from the need to avoid stereotypes to the need for complex characterization to the need for realism and accuracy. On that note, what new suggestions might be added to the existing lists of guidelines? One additional concept to consider is the need for inclusive representation. This is related to the guidelines for complex and accurate characterization, since in real life, people with disabilities are complex individuals, and focusing on only one aspect of their identity tends to obscure this. Leininger et al. Evaluated disability representation in Newbery Award-winning books from 1975 to 2009. They found that 63% of characters with disabilities are male and 76% are white. Results indicate that the representation of Newbery characters with disabilities is not proportionate to the current U.S. population of students with disabilities. Further, racial representation portrayed in these books is not representative of the diverse students receiving special education services. So how can librarians find diverse books about characters with disabilities? The new Our Story app on the We Need Diverse Books website makes it possible to search for complex stories about characters with disabilities. Unlike many existing book lists that only include stories about characters with disabilities, Our Story makes it possible to search for books that include multiple themes at the same time. In addition, some of the existing guidelines for accuracy suggest selecting works by authors who know people with disabilities. However, since the time when these lists were written, the concept of own voices fiction has emphasized the need for books written by authors who share the character's background. Corinne Duvy created the Own Voices hashtag in the context of disability representation. Duvy also co-founded the website Disability in Kidlit, where people with disabilities write reviews of stories about characters with disabilities. These perspectives can help librarians and readers evaluate the accuracy and realism of stories about characters with disabilities. This presentation has described some important concepts in the evaluation of disability representation and has reflected the development of these ideas over time. Many educators have emphasized the need for quality literature that avoids stereotypes and uses sensitive language. Complex characterization, accurate representation, and inclusivity are also important considerations in disability representation. By applying these principles, librarians can select books that educate readers about disabilities and help people with disabilities see their experiences reflected accurately and sensitively.